There are things a person carries back from the edge of death that no one warned them about. Not peace, not a white light, fading gently into morning, something stranger, something that doesn't fit inside the life you left behind because it belongs to someone else's. He woke up in a hospital bed in Ohio with the smell of ocean salt in his lungs. He had never seen the ocean. He woke up with a name on his lips, a woman's name. His wife's name is Carol. The name on his lips was not Carol. And he woke up knowing, with the quiet certainty of someone remembering breakfast, that he had drowned in cold water under a wooden dock 43 years before he was born. The doctors told him it was the brain. Oxygen deprivation, vivid hallucination, normal, they said, expected. He nodded. He thanked them. And he never told them about the dock. His name was Daniel Marsh. 53 years old, retired civil engineer, husband, father of 2 grown daughters, owner of a golden retriever named Scout, who slept at the foot of the bed every night without exception. He was, by every reasonable measure, an ordinary man. He paid his taxes early. He kept the gutters clean. He had the same breakfast every morning for 11 years, black coffee, 2 eggs over easy, wheat toast, and he did not find this repetition sad. He found it reliable. He found it kind. Daniel believed in what he could see, what he could measure, what he could build with his hands or model on a screen. He had spent 30 years calculating load-bearing capacities, stress tolerances, the precise weight a structure could hold before it began to fail. He trusted numbers. He trusted physics. He trusted the world to behave the way the world was supposed to behave. He did not believe in past lives. He had never thought about past lives, not seriously, not even in the loose, half-joking way some people entertain the idea at dinner parties after the second glass of wine. It simply wasn't a category that existed for him. When people died, Daniel believed, they were gone, not somewhere else, not in transition, gone the way a fire is gone when the last ember cools. He wasn't bitter about this. It was just the shape of his understanding. He was 53 years old and he had never once questioned it. Then came the morning of March 4th. He had woken up at 5:47. He knows the time because the clock on the nightstand was the first thing he reached for out of habit, the way you reach for something familiar when the world doesn't yet feel solid. Carol was asleep beside him. Scout was at the foot of the bed. Everything was exactly as it should have been. Except his chest. There was a pressure in his chest that he would later describe in the careful, precise language of an engineer as localized and asymmetrical. Not the crushing, obvious fist of a heart attack, nothing so dramatic. Something subtler. A weight, he said, like someone had set something heavy on his sternum and forgotten to take it off. He lay still for a few minutes. He told himself it was nothing. He got up anyway because Daniel was not a man who stayed in bed when something felt wrong. He went to the kitchen. He started the coffee. He sat down at the table and put his hand flat against his chest, feeling his own heartbeat the way you press your palm to a wall to check for a leak somewhere inside. The heart was beating. Irregular, not violently, but wrong. He called out to Carol. She found him at the table, pale in the early light, his hand still pressed to his chest, and she said later that the thing she remembers most is that he wasn't frightened. He was concentrating, like he was trying to solve something. The ambulance arrived in 9 minutes. He remembers the ceiling of the hallway, the specific texture of it, popcorn plaster, slightly yellowed near the light fixture, and he remembers thinking in a way that embarrasses him now to admit that someone really ought to repaint that. He remembers the cold of the gurney through the back of his shirt. He remembers Carol's hand on his forearm and the particular grip of it, firm and a little too tight. The grip of someone trying to hold on to something they feel slipping. He does not remember losing consciousness. There was no transition, no moment where the world went dark and something else began. One instant he was in the hallway looking at the ceiling, and then, without any perceptible gap, without any sense of time having passed, he was somewhere else entirely. Not a place he could describe easily. Not then, and not now. 3 years later, sitting across a table and searching for words that were built for an entirely different kind of experience. He says, it was like being in a space that had no walls but wasn't open either. He says there was light, but it wasn't coming from anywhere. He stops. He shakes his head. It was like remembering something. He finally says, the whole thing felt like memory. Not a dream. Memory. And within that space, within whatever that was, there was a life that was not his. Not fragments, not impressions. A life. Coherent, sequential, weighted with a particular texture of lived experience, a childhood near water. Cold water, the sound of a wooden dock under bare feet, the specific creak of it, the smell of low tide and diesel, and something he would later identify with startling precision as a particular brand of motor oil used on fishing boats in the 1940s. He knew things in that space that Daniel Marsh had no way of knowing. And that is where we have to stay for a moment. Right there, on the edge of that, because what comes next changes everything. The name came first, not his name, the other one. It arrived the way your own name arrives when someone calls you in a crowded room, not as a sound you consciously process, but as a recognition that happens before thought, automatic. Pre-verbal, the kind of knowing that lives below the level where you decide things. Thomas. He didn't hear it spoken. It was simply there, the way your own reflection is simply there when you walk past a mirror, unremarkable in its certainty. Thomas. And with the name came the weight of it, not just a label, but a whole architecture of personhood. Preferences, habits, the specific way this man held a cigarette between his first 2 fingers, cupped against the wind. The sound of a woman laughing in another room, and the feeling, not thought, feeling, that it was the best sound in the world and that he would do anything to keep hearing it. Daniel Marsh had never smoked a cigarette in his life. The woman's name came next, Eleanor. And when that name arrived, something happened in Daniel's chest that he still cannot fully account for. He describes it as grief, but grief isn't quite right. Grief implies loss, implies something that was there and is now gone. This was different. This was the grief of having forgotten something essential for a very long time and suddenly, terribly, remembering it. Not loss. Recognition, the specific anguish of a thing recovered too late. He had loved Eleanor, Thomas had loved Eleanor, and in that space, in whatever that was, Daniel felt it as if it were his own, as if 30 years of a marriage that was not his, children that were not his, a kitchen that was not his with yellow curtains and a cracked window above the sink had been poured into him all at once. He wept. He is certain of this, though he had no body to weep with. The life of Thomas unfolded in that space the way a film reel might unspool, not scene by scene in a straight line, but in the layered associative way that real memory actually works. One thing leads to another through feeling rather than chronology. The smell of low tide leads to the dock, leads to the morning he and his brother repaired the eastern plank, leads to his brother's laugh, leads to the telegram that arrived in August 1943, leads to the telegram, leads to the kitchen table, leads to Eleanor's hand on his shoulder, not moving for a very long time. The brother's name was Robert. He died at 21 in the Pacific Theatre. Daniel knows this the way he knows his own daughter's birthdays, not as a fact he learned, but as a fact he carries. He knows the name of the town, Gloucester, Massachusetts. He knows the street, or rather Thomas knew the street, and Daniel carries that knowledge now like something left in a coat pocket by a previous owner. Cedar Lane. The number was 14. The house was white with green shutters, and the shutters on the left side of the front window had one broken louver that Thomas kept meaning to fix and never did. Small failures have a way of outlasting us. He knows that Thomas Calloway, that was the full name, Thomas William Calloway, died on September 17th, 1958. He died in the water, under the dock at the south end of Cedar Lane, where the land drops sharply and the current runs colder than it should this close to shore. It was early morning. He had gone down before sunrise to check the mooring lines after a storm. He slipped. The water was cold. He was 51 years old. Daniel was told none of this. Daniel was told nothing. And yet, here is what the doctors said when Daniel woke. Mild cardiac event, brief loss of consciousness, possible hypoxic episode. Not uncommon in men his age. They used the word episode the way people use it when they want to make something large sound temporary. He was monitored for 18 hours. He was sent home with a prescription and a follow-up appointment and a pamphlet about reducing dietary sodium. He did not mention Thomas. He did not mention Eleanor or Robert or the dock or the specific sound of wooden planks over cold water in the dark before dawn. He lay in the hospital bed and stared at the ceiling. Different ceiling, this one clean and white and institutional, and he assembled the experience the way he would assemble data from a structural survey. Methodically, looking for the load-bearing elements, looking for where it held and where it failed. The thing that would not resolve, the thing that sat in the center of the data like an anomaly he couldn't engineer around was this, the specificity. He had been a man who built things for a living. He understood the difference between a vague impression and a precise measurement. What he had experienced was not vague. The broken louver on the left shutter, the specific brand of motor oil, the date, September 17th, 1958. The way a cracked window above a kitchen sink lets in a sound like breathing when the wind comes from the north. These were not the textures of hallucination. These were the textures of memory. And memory, Daniel knew better than most, does not invent memory records. The question, the one he carried home in the passenger seat of Carol's car, watching the familiar Ohio landscape scroll past the window like scenery from a life he was no longer entirely certain was his. The question was simply this: whose memory? Carol knew something had changed before Daniel could find the words for it. This is the way it often works with people who have shared a bed for 26 years. Language becomes secondary. You develop a literacy of the other person that operates below speech, the particular way they hold their shoulders when they're processing something difficult, the quality of their silence, the small tells that distinguish the silence of contentment from the silence of a man who has encountered something he doesn't know how to file. Carol noticed he had stopped eating the same breakfast. It sounds small. It was not small. 11 years of black coffee, 2 eggs over easy, wheat toast, and then, one morning, approximately 2 weeks after he came home from the hospital, Daniel stood in front of the open refrigerator for a long time, and then made oatmeal. And then made oatmeal the next day. And the day after that, she didn't ask him about it immediately. She watched. She also noticed that he had begun standing at the back window in the evenings, the one that faces the yard and the old oak tree that drops its leaves every November in a single dramatic weekend. He would stand there with his coffee cup, still black, that hadn't changed, and look at nothing in particular for 10 or 15 minutes at a stretch. Scout would come and lean against his leg. Daniel would put his hand on the dog's back without looking down, just resting it there, anchoring. She gave him 3 weeks before she asked. They were sitting at the kitchen table after dinner, the dishes done, the house quiet, in the way it gets quiet when the children are grown and gone, and the particular silence of a house built for more people than it currently holds settles into the walls. Carol put her hand on the table between them, not on his hand, just near it available, and she said, "Tell me what's happening with you, not what happened, what's happening, present tense." She was asking about the ongoing thing, not the event. Daniel looked at her hand on the table. He looked at it for a long time, and then he told her. He told her carefully. He is, by nature, a careful man, and he approached the telling the way he approaches a structural problem, systematically, with attention to the sequence, making sure each element was in place before adding the next. He told her about the space, about the light with no source, about Thomas, about Eleanor and the yellow curtains and the broken shutter louver and the date in September. He told her about the dock. Carol listened without interrupting. This is one of her great qualities, the capacity to hold space for something without immediately reaching for a category to put it in. She is a woman who has learned, through years of living with a man who speaks in precise measurements, to wait for the full picture before responding. When he finished, she was quiet for a moment. Then she said, "Have you looked it up?" He hadn't. He had been afraid to. This surprised him because Daniel Marsh was not, in any general sense, an afraid man. He had never been particularly afraid of heights or illness or failure or the minor ambient uncertainties that keep other people awake at 3 a.m. But the thought of searching for Thomas Calloway, the typing those words into a search engine and pressing enter, had sat in front of him for 3 weeks like a door he wasn't sure he wanted to open. Because there were only 2 possibilities on the other side of that door. Either Thomas Calloway did not exist, in which case Daniel had experienced something his brain manufactured entirely, and the question became what, exactly, a healthy brain was doing generating this level of specificity from nothing. Or Thomas Calloway did exist, in which case the question became something else entirely. Something that Daniel, with all his load-bearing calculations and stress tolerances, did not have a framework to hold. Carol reached across the table and opened the laptop. She typed, "Thomas Calloway, Gloucester, Massachusetts." She pressed enter. She turned the screen toward him. He will tell you, if you ask him, that he did not feel triumph in that moment. He did not feel vindicated or electrified or any other things you might expect a person to feel when the thing they feared was real turns out to be real. What he felt was quieter than that and more devastating. He felt recognized. The first result was a digitized obituary from the Gloucester Daily Times dated September 19th, 1958, 2 days after the death. The name was there. Thomas William Calloway, age 51, of Cedar Lane, Gloucester. Beloved husband of Eleanor, brother of the late Robert Calloway who predeceased him in 1943. A fisherman. A quiet man, the obituary said, in the particular way that obituaries describe men whose depth was invisible to the world that recorded their passing. The cause of death, accidental drowning, the location, the dock at the south end of Cedar Lane, September 17th, 1958. Daniel read it twice. He read it a third time, and then he pushed the laptop gently back across the table and put both his hands flat on the surface in front of him, and breathed. Carol put her hand over his. Neither of them spoke for a long time. Outside, the old oak tree held its leaves. It was still autumn, still weeks before the single dramatic weekend, and Scout had fallen asleep against the baseboard heater with the effortless conviction of a creature that has never once questioned the solidity of the world it inhabits. Inside, Daniel sat with the particular stillness of a man who has just watched his entire understanding of reality sustain a load it was never designed to carry. It held, barely, but it held. And the question, the new question, the one that replaced the old one, was not whose memory. That question had answered itself with a newspaper from 1958. The new question was simpler and far more difficult. Why his? He did not sleep that night, not because he was agitated. He was not, or not exactly. It was something more like the sleeplessness that comes after a long journey when the body has finally stopped moving, but the nervous system hasn't received the message yet. A kind of alert stillness. He lay in the dark beside Carol, who had fallen asleep with her hand still near his on the mattress, and he stared at the ceiling and let the information settle the way sediment settles in still water, slowly, in layers. By 3 in the morning, he had stopped trying to explain it. This was, for Daniel, an extraordinary concession. He was a man who had spent his entire professional life explaining things, translating the physical world into the language of mathematics, finding the underlying logic of every structure, every stress point, every failure. He had never encountered a problem that resisted long enough to earn his surrender. He had always found the load-bearing principle eventually, the thing holding everything up. But Thomas Calloway was not a structural problem, and the part of his mind that wanted to treat it as one, that wanted to locate the anomaly, identify the source, reduce it to something manageable, kept reaching and finding nothing to grip. Around 4 in the morning he got up quietly and went to the kitchen and sat in the dark at the table where they had opened the laptop the night before. Scout came padding in behind him, as he always does, and settled under the table against Daniel's feet. Daniel sat with his coffee in the dark and the sound of the house breathing around him, and he let himself, for the first time, simply sit with it, not solve it, not file it, just hold it. And what he noticed, sitting there in the dark, was that he was not afraid. He had expected fear. He had braced for it, the existential vertigo of discovering that something you had confidently believed your entire life was simply and demonstrably wrong. He had expected the floor to go out from under him, and instead what he felt was something he would spend the next several months trying to name precisely, because precision mattered to him even in this, and he didn't want to reach for the easy word if the easy word wasn't right. The closest he could come to it was expansion. Not peace exactly, not comfort, something more structural than that. As if a wall he hadn't known was there had been quietly removed, and the room he was living in turned out to be larger than the blueprints had indicated. He went to Gloucester 6 weeks later. Carol wanted to come. He asked her to let him go alone, not because he was shutting her out, but because he understood, with the instinct of someone who has spent a lifetime solving things quietly, that this was something he needed to meet without a witness, at least the first time. She understood this. She is, as I said, a woman who waits for the full picture. He drove 11 hours from Columbus, Ohio to Gloucester, Massachusetts. He did it in a single day, leaving before dawn, arriving in the early afternoon with the light coming off the harbour at that particular autumn angle that makes everything look simultaneously ordinary and ancient. He had not told anyone he was coming. There was no one to tell. Thomas Calloway's Eleanor had died in 1979. There were, as far as his research had uncovered, no surviving children. The house on Cedar Lane had passed through 4 different owners since 1958. He drove to Cedar Lane first. He parked at the end of the street and sat in the car for a while, just looking. The houses were close together, the way houses in old New England fishing towns tend to cluster, as if they'd agreed, generations ago, to keep each other warm. The trees were mostly bare, the light was flat and cold and honest. Number 14 was not white anymore. It was grey now, a steel grey that looked recent, the kind of colour chosen by someone who had bought the house for its bones and wanted to modernise it gently. The shutters were not green, they were black, and they were new. The broken louver was gone. He sat in the car and looked at it. He did not feel the grief he had felt in that hospital space. That grief had belonged to Thomas, and Thomas's grief was about Eleanor, and Eleanor had been dead for more than 40 years. What Daniel felt, looking at the grey house where the green shutters used to be, was something quieter, something close to the feeling you get when you visit a place from your childhood and find it smaller than you remembered, except the childhood wasn't his. And the house wasn't smaller, just different, just changed the way everything changes when enough time passes. He got out of the car and walked to the end of Cedar Lane. The dock was still there. He had not expected the dock to still be there. It was old. Clearly old, the kind of old that carries its age in its posture, the way certain people do, leaning slightly, bearing the weight of having stood in place through many different weathers. The planks were weathered grey, some of them replaced in mismatched wood that hadn't quite caught up to the surrounding colour yet. The south end, where the land dropped sharply, where the current ran colder than it should this close to shore, he recognised it. not from having seen it, from having known it. He stood at the edge of the dock for a long time. The water below was dark and very still. The cold came off it in the way cold comes off deep water, not as a temperature exactly, but as a presence, something down there, patient and indifferent, that has been waiting since long before you arrived and will be waiting long after you leave. He put his hand on one of the dock posts, old wood, salt-roughened, wrapped at the base with rusted iron that had bled orange stains down into the grain over the decades. He held on to it. He doesn't know why. It felt like the right thing to do. And then something happened that he has never fully been able to explain. Standing there with his hand on that post, looking out at the still dark water in the cold October light, Daniel felt, not thought, felt that it was all right. Not that it was resolved, not that he understood it, not that the questions had been answered or the anomaly explained or the load-bearing principle identified, none of that. Just all right, the specific quality of all right that has nothing to do with things being good and everything to do with things being exactly as they are supposed to be. He stood there for a while longer. Then he let go of the post. He walked back up Cedar Lane to his car. He drove to a diner he had noticed on the way in, a small place with steamed windows and a hand-lettered sign, and he ordered oatmeal. And he sat alone in a booth in Gloucester, Massachusetts, eating oatmeal. And outside the window the harbour moved the way harbours move, with the patient, indifferent rhythm of something that has been doing this for a very long time and intends to keep doing it. He felt he would tell Carol later, like he had kept an appointment he hadn't known was on the calendar. When he came home from Gloucester, Daniel did something he had never done before in his adult life. He started asking questions he didn't expect to answer. This is harder than it sounds for certain kinds of minds. There is a particular discipline required to hold a question without reaching for a resolution, to let it sit open, the way a window is left open, not because you're waiting for something specific to come through it, but because closed feels wrong. Daniel had spent 30 years as a man who closed things, who finished the calculation and signed off on the drawing and moved to the next project. Open questions were, in his professional life, a problem to be solved, an incomplete state, a structural deficiency. Now he had a question he couldn't close, and he was discovering, with something between discomfort and relief, that not closing it was the only honest option. He began reading. He was not, by habit, a reader of this particular kind of literature. He had read plenty in his life, history, biography, the occasional novel when Carol pressed one into his hands with a look that meant she thought it would do him good. But he had never read about consciousness or death or what, if anything, persists beyond it. It simply hadn't been a category that required investigation. The investigation had been unnecessary because the conclusion had seemed obvious. The conclusion no longer seemed obvious. He started where an engineer would start, with the data. There were, it turned out, more data than he had expected. Decades of documented cases, people who had left their bodies during medical emergencies and reported specific, verifiable details about events occurring in other rooms, on other floors, sometimes in other cities. Children who had described previous lives with the particularity of eyewitnesses and led researchers to obscure deaths in obscure places they had never been. The University of Virginia had been studying this quietly, seriously, for more than 50 years. He had not known this. He suspected most people did not know this. He read Ian Stevenson's collected cases. He read them the way he read technical manuals, cover to cover, with a pencil, noting anomalies, flagging methodology, looking for the seams. The seams were there, as seams always are. But so was something else, a pattern of specificity that resisted the explanations he kept trying to apply to it. Children who knew the names of dead strangers' relatives, who identified murderers, who bore birthmarks in the precise locations of fatal wounds from previous lives, mapped to autopsy reports that the children had never seen and their parents had never known existed. He is not a credulous man. He wants you to understand this. He did not read Stevenson and feel the relief of a man whose experience had been validated. He felt something more complicated, the specific unease of a structural engineer who has just discovered that a building he assumed was impossible has been standing quietly and unremarkably for 50 years. The building doesn't care whether you believe in it. He went back to work in February. His cardiologist had cleared him. The cardiac event had been real but relatively minor, a small electrical misfiring that the heart had corrected on its own, the kind of thing that happens sometimes to men in their 50s and means little beyond a prompt to eat less salt and do more walking. The heart was fine. The heart had always been fine. It was everything behind the heart that had changed. His colleagues noticed but said little. He had always been a quiet man at work, thorough, precise, good in meetings because he spoke rarely and therefore people paid attention when he did. The quiet was the same. Something else was different. One colleague, a woman named Patricia, who had worked beside him for 18 years and therefore had developed the same kind of below-language literacy that Carol had, told him months later that she had noticed he had stopped hurrying. Not that he had become slower exactly, just that the low-level urgency that underlies most professional behavior, the constant subtle pressure of deadline and output and the next thing, seemed to have lifted from him somehow. He moved through the office as if he had nowhere to be other than exactly where he was. He found this description accurate when she offered it. He accepted it. What he couldn't explain to Patricia, what he couldn't explain to most people without watching their expressions perform the particular gymnastics of polite disbelief, was that the lifting had a source, that it was connected specifically and directly to standing on a dock in Gloucester in October with his hand on a salt-roughened post, feeling that it was all right, that something he had been late for or carrying without knowing had been set down. Thomas had died there. And Daniel had, in whatever way the word applies to something this unprecedented in a person's understanding of reality, returned there on Thomas's behalf. He does not claim to understand the mechanism. He is not sure mechanism is even the right category. But the weight had lifted, and the weight had been real, and its lifting was real. And he is an engineer, and engineers trust what they can measure. He could measure the absence, the place where something heavy had been. There are people who, when Daniel tells this story, want to reach immediately for the explanation that comforts them most. The brain, they say, anoxia. The desperate creativity of an oxygen-deprived cortex spinning a narrative out of noise. And Daniel nods because he has had this thought himself many times with considerably more rigour than they are currently applying to it. He understands the argument. He finds it unsatisfying, not because it threatens him, but because it cannot account for the date. September 17th, 1958. A hypoxic brain generating a narrative does not generate accurate dates. It generates emotion, sensation, the broad strokes of story, the impressionistic rendering of a life. It does not cross-reference obituaries in small-town Massachusetts newspapers from 60 years ago and arrive at the correct day. The argument from anoxia, Daniel will tell you quietly, does not load bear. It looks sound from the outside, but put weight on it and it fails. He is not angry when he says this. He is not defensive. He has the patience of a man who has done the math and is simply reporting the result. What he says when pressed is this: I don't know what it was, I know what it wasn't. And the distance between those two things is where I live now. It is not a comfortable address. He will tell you that too, but it is an honest one. And honesty, in his experience, is more load-bearing than comfort ever was. There was one detail he hadn't told anyone. Not Carol, not the cardiologist, not the colleague named Patricia, who had noticed he'd stopped hurrying, not even himself, fully. He had circled it in his mind for months, the way you circle a room where something has happened that you're not yet ready to walk back into. He had allowed it to exist at the edge of his awareness without bringing it into the center, because the center was already asking more of him than he had expected, and some part of him had decided, without consciously deciding, that this particular detail required a different kind of readiness. He told it for the first time in the spring, 8 months after the hospital. A Tuesday evening, nothing special. Carol making dinner and the kitchen full of the smell of something warm and the particular domestic comfort of a life that has been, against considerable odds, held together. He was sitting at the table watching her at the stove, and he said it the way you say the thing you've been not saying. Not dramatically, not with the build-up it perhaps deserved, but quietly, as if it had simply found its own moment. He said, "There's something else." Carol turned from the stove. She waited. He said, "In that space, when I was wherever I was, there was a moment near the end of it, or what felt like the end. Thomas's life had moved through me. The whole arc of it, and I was standing at the dock, not the way I stood there in October, not with my body, but in the memory, in his memory. I was there the way he was there, that last morning. Before dawn, the storm had passed. He was checking the mooring lines. He stopped, looked at his hands on the table. He wasn't alone, he said. In Thomas's memory, in whatever that was, whatever the word is for experiencing another life from the inside, the dock was dark. The sky had the particular lightlessness of early morning before the horizon has decided what it's going to do. The water was black and very still after the storm. Thomas was moving along the dock with the careful, automatic competence of someone who has done this 1,000 times, who knows the wood beneath his feet the way he knows his own kitchen, who doesn't need light because he has the map of this place in his body. And at the far end of the dock, at the south end where the current runs cold, there was a figure, not threatening. Daniel says this before anything else because he knows the shape that fear takes in a story, and he doesn't want you to go there. Not threatening, quiet, still in the particular way that certain kinds of stillness are not emptiness but presence, the stillness of something that has been waiting patiently and without urgency, for as long as it takes. He couldn't see the face. He doesn't know if that's a function of the darkness or something else, something about the nature of how that kind of perception works, if perception is even the right word. But he knew, Thomas knew, and Daniel felt it as Thomas felt it, that the figure was known to them, not a stranger. Someone recognized from a distance the way you recognize someone you love before you can see their features, by the shape of them, by the way they hold themselves against the world. It was Robert Calloway, younger brother, dead in the Pacific in 1943, 15 years before, dead at 21. He was standing at the end of the dock and he was waiting, and when Thomas reached him, in whatever way reaching happens in a memory that belongs to a dead man inside another man's cardiac event, there was no surprise. There was the opposite of surprise. There was the meeting of two people who had both known for a very long time that this meeting was going to happen. The particular quality of reunion that has no drama in it because there was never any real doubt. Carol had stopped pretending to cook. She was standing with the wooden spoon held at her side, not moving, looking at him. Daniel said, he wasn't afraid. Thomas wasn't afraid. That's the thing I keep coming back to. The water, the dark, the cold. He'd slipped. He was in the water. It was happening. And it wasn't fear. It was more like, he said, it was more like stepping through something, a doorway. And on the other side of it, his brother was there. He looked up from his hands. I felt it, he said. I felt what Thomas felt when he saw Robert, and I don't have words for it that don't sound like the words I'd use for something smaller, but it was complete. That's the only word. It was the feeling of something being complete. He had not expected to cry telling it. He is not someone who cries easily or often or in kitchens on Tuesday evenings 8 months after an almost ordinary cardiac event. But something in the telling of it, in taking it out of the place where he had been keeping it and setting it down in the open air of the kitchen with Carol and the smell of dinner and the dog asleep against the baseboard heater, something in the telling unlocked what the experience had not. The grief came, and it was not Thomas's grief this time, or not only. It was Daniel's, the grief of a man who had spent 53 years in a world he believed was smaller than it is. He cried briefly and without drama, the way he does everything. Carol came and sat beside him. Neither of them spoke for a while, then she said quietly, "Do you think that's why it was you, because you needn't to know?" He thought about this for a long time. "I don't know," he said finally. "Maybe. Or maybe Thomas needed someone to go back to the dock, someone who would understand what they found there and not look away." He looked at the table. Maybe it was both things at once. This is the part of Daniel's story that tends to quiet a room, not because it's the most dramatic element, it isn't by conventional standards, but because it asks something of the listener that the rest of the story doesn't. The cardiac event, the obituary, the date in September, these are the elements that challenge the mind. They ask you to look at your assumptions about what is possible and hold them up to the light. But Robert on the dock asks something different. It doesn't challenge the mind so much as it addresses something below the mind. The part of a person that has lost someone and carries the loss the way Daniel carried the weight in his chest that March morning, not dramatically, not consciously, just as a permanent feature of the interior landscape. Present the way certain weights are present, only noticeable when, for a moment, they lift. The idea that there is someone waiting, not as a theological proposition, not as a promise from a tradition you may or may not trust. Just as a man's account of what he experienced in a space beyond ordinary consciousness, where another man's death became available to him like an open book, and at the end of the last chapter, on the last page, in the final image of a life that was not his, there was a younger brother, standing at the end of a dock in the dark, waiting, not afraid, complete. The letters started arriving in April. Daniel had not anticipated this. He had told his story exactly once in a setting beyond his own kitchen, a small gathering organized by a woman in Columbus who ran what she called, with deliberate understatement, a discussion group for people interested in unexplained experience. Carol had found it. She had shown him the flyer the way she had once shown him Stevenson's book, not pushing, just making the existence of something known and leaving the decision to him. He went once, expecting nothing in particular, expecting perhaps a room full of people he had nothing in common with, dreamers, the credulous, the kind of people who reach for mystery because reality has disappointed them. He had prepared himself privately and without malice to be the most skeptical person in the room. He was not the most skeptical person in the room. There was a retired physician, a former airline pilot, a woman who had taught high school mathematics for 31 years, a contractor who had built houses in central Ohio for 4 decades. These were people Daniel recognized immediately, who had spent their lives inside the same epistemological house he had, measuring, building, trusting what could be tested. And they were sitting in folding chairs in a church fellowship hall in Columbus, Ohio, talking about what had happened to them at the edges of consciousness with the same careful, slightly embarrassed precision that Daniel had been using with himself for 8 months. He told his story, the whole of it, including Robert on the dock. When he finished, the room was quiet for a moment, and then the retired physician said, "The date, September 17th. You knew the date before you found the obituary?" Daniel said yes. The physician nodded slowly, the way physicians nod when a diagnostic result confirms what they suspected, but hoped was wrong. "That's the one," he said. "That's always the one that breaks the argument." The letters came because the woman who ran the group, her name was Margaret, a former social worker with the specific kind of practical compassion that comes from decades of sitting with people in their worst moments. Margaret had a newsletter, a modest thing printed and mailed because most of her members were of an age that preferred paper. She asked Daniel if she could include a summary of his account. He said yes, because by April he had come to understand that holding the story privately was a kind of hoarding, and hoarding had never been his nature. The letters came from strangers, from Iowa, from Tennessee, from a small town in northern Michigan that Daniel had to look up on a map. From a woman in her 70s who had lost her husband and wanted to tell Daniel that she believed him, and why. From a man who had been a marine biologist and who described in precise technical language an out-of-body experience during surgery, that had allowed him to observe from the ceiling of the operating room a specific instrument left on a specific tray in a specific position that he later verified with the surgical nurse. From a woman who had, at the age of 5, described in detail the living room of a house she had never entered, belonging to a family she had never met, in a town 200 miles from where she was born, and who had been telling the story for 60 years to anyone who would sit still long enough to hear it, which was, she wrote, fewer people than you might hope. He read them all. He answered them all. This took time. More time than he had expected, more than he had available in the margins of his regular life, but he found he couldn't not answer them. There was something in the letters that asked for the same thing Robert had asked for at the end of the doc, acknowledgement. The simple, enormous act of being believed. One letter stopped him. It came from a man in Gloucester. The man's name was Gerald Finch. He was 81 years old. He had lived in Gloucester his entire life. He had known Thomas Calloway, had worked alongside him on the water for nearly a decade. He wrote, in the careful, slightly formal prose of a man who learned to write in a different era. They had not been close friends, he said, but he had known him. The way you know a man you see every day on the water, in all weather, over many years. He had read the summary of Daniel's account in Margaret's newsletter. His granddaughter had shown it to him. He had read it 3 times. He wrote, "There is one thing in your account that I have not been able to set down since I read it. You mentioned the motor oil. You described a specific smell from the fishing boats. I don't know how a man in Ohio knows what that smells like. I've been on those boats. I know exactly what you mean." And then, Thomas was a quiet man, private. He didn't talk much about himself, but there is something I knew about him that I have never told anyone, because it was his to keep and not mine to share. Now that I've read what happened to you, I find I may have been wrong about that. He used to say, only once or twice in the way men say the things they believe but don't discuss, that he felt he had left something unfinished. He couldn't say what, just unfinished, like a calculation that hadn't closed. Maybe it has now.